"50 years ago, thousands of Vietnamese refugees arrived in America with little more than the clothes on their backs and memories of a homeland left behind. Today, we explore how these evacuees transformed themselves from displaced people into one of America's most vibrant communities." I'm walking through the busy streets of Garden Grove, the heart of Little Saigon. The sights and sounds and aromas are unfamiliar and exotic. It's a lively community with a real heartbeat, lots of hustle and bustle and shops and traffic. Not so different, really, from any other town in Orange County, except that almost all of the businesses have hung their shingles in Vietnamese. Even the ones that use the Latin alphabet are spelling out Vietnamese names. Almost everyone I see is Vietnamese. If it weren't for the street signs and traffic signs, I could easily forget that I'm in California. Incredibly, none of this was here 50 years ago. Back then, this whole area was just farmland, strawberry fields and orange groves mainly. The story of how refugees built this thriving cultural enclave from nothing is a testament to resilience, determination, and the American promise of new beginnings. In this episode, we'll meet the people who made this journey, from processing centers on military bases to the establishment of Little Saigon. We'll explore the challenges they faced and how they preserved their cultural identity while embracing their new homeland. The transformation of Vietnamese refugees and immigrants into Vietnamese Americans reveals how communities can be remade, even after a devastating loss.
We're coming from a war-torn country with 20, 30 years of nation building in the south of Vietnam during a full-blown civil, regional, and international war.
At our lowest point, we were living in a boarded-up garage.
I grew up in the generation of assimilation. I spoke Vietnamese at home, but once I entered the school system, I only spoke English.
Stick around. From the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund, founders of The Wall, this is Echoes of the Vietnam War. I'm your host, Michael Crone, bringing you stories of service, sacrifice, and healing from people who still feel the impact of that conflict more than 50 years later. Episode 97, From Refugees to Residents, right after this.
Hello, I'm Gary Sinise. Nearly 3 million Americans served in Vietnam, and more than 58,000 have their names inscribed on the wall. Those that pay the ultimate price in service to America. Some might ask why the Vietnam War still matters. It matters because more than 58,000 lives were cut short and their families forever changed. It matters because we should never forget how Vietnam veterans were treated when they came home. A lesson learned so that our current generation of veterans are treated with respect. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund, the organization that built the wall, works to ensure that future generations will understand the war's impact. I'm asking you to help keep the promise the wall was built on. Never forget. Visit vvmf.org to find out how you can get involved.
By the time the last helicopters lifted off from the roof of the American Embassy in Saigon in April 1975, thousands of South Vietnamese refugees had already been evacuated to U.S. military bases for processing. But that was just the beginning of their journey. The fall of Saigon triggered what would become one of the largest refugee crises in modern history, with waves of Vietnamese people fleeing their homeland over the next 2 decades. These refugees fell into several distinct categories. First were the evacuees, those who left before or during the final days of April 1975. Then came those who escaped by sea in the late 1970s and early 1980s, the boat people who risked their lives on overcrowded, often unseaworthy vessels. Others came through official resettlement programs, especially former South Vietnamese military officers released from re-education camps, and still others arrived through family reunification programs in the 1990s. Each wave brought its own set of challenges and experiences. To understand what happened in those early days, I spoke with Do Jung, editor-in-chief of the Nui Viet Daily News, the oldest Vietnamese language newspaper in America.
1975, right after the Vietnam War was ended, there was a big wave of Vietnamese refugees came to the U.S. They was put in 4 camps, 4 refugee camps. I believe one in Camp Pendleton in California, another one in Arkansas, another one in Florida, another one in Pennsylvania. But the one in Camp Pendleton in California, the biggest one. And after that, people move around the country. But most people in Camp Pendleton, they moved to Little Saigon.
Those refugee camps provided temporary shelter, basic necessities, and initial processing for Vietnamese evacuees, but they were never meant to be permanent homes. The U.S. government's policy was to disperse refugees across the country to promote faster assimilation into American society. Joe Dovin, now Mayor Pro Tem of Garden Grove, explains how this dispersal worked.
Originally, there were several military bases where the first evacuees were brought from Vietnam. And I say evacuees because they're also known as the first wave of Vietnamese immigrants or refugees. Why they're not refugees per se is because they came before the fall of Saigon, and they had been drawn up in a roster of people to be evacuated out of South Vietnam upon the impending collapse of the South Vietnamese government. And the people who were slated to be evacuated were people who were considered the most under threat of a communist retaliation. So, for example, if you work for the American government in any capacity, even as a non-government organization like Red Cross, you would be considered at risk. Or if you work for the U.S. Embassy, not so much military personnel. The intent was not to evacuate military personnel from the Republic of South Vietnam, but in my case, my father was a pastor for Christian Missionary Alliance, a CMA, which is part of the World Church organization. And the World Church is the one that drawn up my family membership to be evacuated. Because even pastors were considered and their family targets to be retaliated by the incoming communist government. And then these families who were evacuated, or first wave of refugees, immigrants, were sponsored out to other cities and other states. The policy back then was to maximize the assimilation and integration of the refugees into mainstream American society. So you didn't want to clump them up in certain communities. You wanted to spread them out throughout the 50 states as much as you can, which was what happened after the refugees came to the Marine base and the different military bases. It was also in Virginia and the East Coast and other locations, and then they were sponsored out. A lot of it through the help of religious organizations like the USCC, United States Catholic Conference, the IOC, and any of a number of religious organizations who provided the sponsorship. So people went to all communities all over the country.
The dispersal policy was well-intentioned, but often placed refugees in unfamiliar and sometimes inhospitable environments. Many found themselves in rural communities in the Midwest or Northeast, facing harsh winters and extreme cultural isolation. Without established Vietnamese communities nearby, everyday tasks like finding food or practicing their religion became very difficult. Dr. Julie Pham's experience illustrates the difficulty of finding the right place to settle.
We were sponsored by my mom's relatives in Florida. The first place we landed, though, was in Seattle, was at the airport in Seattle. And my parents said they remember how welcoming the Vietnamese community was in Seattle. And they came out to the airport because they heard that there were all of these refugees. And they brought all this food. And they were just, life is really good here. And then we went to Florida, where our sponsors were. And my parents told me that they couldn't stay in Florida. They wandered the streets. They stayed for a few months. And they were just, no, we can't do this. And so then they actually borrowed some money and went to California, where we had some relatives, and eventually they remembered how welcoming the Vietnamese community was in Seattle. And so we went to Seattle. We were the only ones in our family to be there, but it was just, hey, it seems like this would be a good community. And so that's where my family's been ever since.
Despite the government's dispersal strategy, Vietnamese refugees began migrating to areas where they could find community, economic opportunity, and a familiar climate. Southern California, and Orange County in particular, emerged as a magnet for these families. But the process of embracing a new beginning wasn't easy. Far from it, many refugees still carried the psychological scars of war and escape. When I asked Joe Dovin whether he attended the 50th anniversary commemoration on the USS Midway in San Diego, his answer surprised me.
I don't like crowds. That's another thing. And I'll tell you why I don't like crowds. Because little kids like me who grew up in the war also have PTSD. I also have post-traumatic stress disorder. And memories of fleeing from the central to the south. And then in Saigon itself. So every time I see crowds, I'm traumatized. I was packed into a barge like sardines, and many people fell off the barge before we got picked up. And many people fell into the ocean during the big waves, and they didn't get picked up, and they were all crowded in. So I can't remember a happy moment with crowds, ever.
Language barriers, cultural adjustments, and financial hardship created additional challenges for Vietnamese refugees and immigrants. They faced the daunting task of rebuilding their entire lives from scratch. For many families, separation from loved ones who remained in Vietnam created lasting emotional wounds. Dr. Pha Le, now an emergency room physician in San Diego, recalls the heartbreaking decision his parents had to make when they were faced with an opportunity to escape from Vietnam. Pha was just 9 years old, the oldest of 3 boys.
What my parents did was they went to the village to pick me up, but they told me that I was the only one going to escape with them. My 2 brothers would be left behind with my grandmother. And the reason for that is that the owners of this operation requested a large sum of money for us to be able to bring my 2 brothers. It's just money that we didn't have. So they decided to take me because I was the oldest and could help them the earliest and avoid the draft in Vietnam that was still going on because they were at war with Cambodia. So they told me to keep it a secret. And then the next morning we left my 2 brothers in Vietnam, not really understanding when we were going to see them again, if we were going to see them again, how we were going to reunite, but just the belief that we were headed to a better life and that we were going to take steps to reunite with them as soon as possible.
The pain of this separation stayed with Pha's family for decades.
We didn't reunite with them for 10 years. And over the next 10 years, I saw the trauma that decision had on my mom especially, and witnessing that trauma surface again and again with the fights that my parents had, with the depression that was settling in on my mom, and the anguish that she expressed every so often, I was reminded several times throughout the first 10 years of us being here without my brothers, how traumatic that was. And we still talk about it now. But now, as a father, I cannot imagine having to sit down with my partner and make that decision.
Sure.
Which child are we going to take, and which children are we going to leave behind?
In the face of these immense challenges, the Vietnamese refugees demonstrated remarkable resilience. Many channeled their trauma and loss into a fierce determination to succeed in their new homeland. This drive would prove crucial as they began to establish communities and rebuild their lives. After a short break, we'll look at how this determination helped create one of America's most distinctive cultural enclaves, Little Saigon. Stick around. Let's talk about the Wall for a minute. It is widely considered to be the memorial that changed memorials forever. Its design invites a level of engagement, of introspection, of reverence that no fountain, no statue of a cannon or a man on a horse could ever match. The volunteers who work there often talk about wall magic, that unexpected, often spiritual connection or discovery that happens when you visit the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. It's one of the reasons why the wall's design has inspired so many other memorials around the world. Of course, there is one little problem with the wall's design. 140 panels of polished black granite aren't exactly portable. So, unless you can get yourself to Washington, D.C., how are you supposed to experience wall magic for yourself? Well, guess what? We already thought of that. In 1996, VVMF unveiled an exact replica of the wall that could be packed into an 18-wheeler and hauled to cities and towns all across America. Since then, the Wall That Heals has been displayed in more than 800 communities throughout the nation, spreading the healing legacy of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial to millions of visitors. Sure, there are other versions of the wall that travel around the country, but the Wall That Heals is the only one that is an exact replica of the one in Washington, created and maintained by the same organization that built the wall in the first place. And not only that, the Wall That Heals is accompanied and curated by VVMF employees who work with host communities to ensure that the experience is as close as possible to the real thing. And that includes wall magic. But you don't have to take my word for it. You can check out episode 15 of this podcast to learn what happens to people's hearts when this traveling exhibit rolls into a real-life American community. The Wall That Heals and the mobile education center that travels with it will be in Shaler Township, Pennsylvania, May 23 through 26, and Warren, Ohio, May 29 through June 1. To see the rest of this year's tour schedule and to learn how you can bring the Wall That Heals to your town, visit vvmf.org. If you're enjoying Echoes of the Vietnam War, I want to let you know about some very easy ways you can help to support the podcast. Here are 3 ideas ranked from easiest to hardest, and the hardest is still pretty easy. Number 1, spread the word. Tell a friend or 2 friends, or better yet, share a favorite episode on your social media accounts so you can let all of your friends know in one go. Number 2, leave us a review or a rating wherever you get your podcasts. Even if you stream Echoes directly from our website, you can still send feedback through the form at the bottom of the page. Number 3, if you're listening from our website, consider following or subscribing on one of the many platforms where podcasts are found, including Spotify, Pandora, iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, and many more. That way, you'll always have the most recent episode automatically downloaded to your mobile device, and you'll boost our subscription numbers, which will help new listeners find us more easily. Thank you so much for just listening. We really appreciate your continued attention to these stories. We'll be extra grateful for your help in spreading the word about Echoes so more people can check out the work we're doing. By the early 1980s, Vietnamese refugees who had initially been resettled across the United States began congregating in Southern California, drawn by the climate, economic opportunity, and growing community. What was it about this particular region that exerted such a powerful pull? In many ways, Southern California offered an environment that reminded refugees of their homeland, a warm climate, access to the ocean, and agricultural conditions that supported familiar fruits, vegetables, and herbs. But beyond these physical characteristics, there was something else at work, the human need for community and cultural connection. As more Vietnamese settled in Orange County, a critical mass began to form. What started as a small cluster of businesses gradually expanded into a thriving commercial district. James, whose family came to America during the evacuation in 1975, recalls the early days of Little Saigon.
20 years ago, there was one intersection where there was a concentration of Vietnamese businesses and merchants, and I think over time it just began to expand from that area until a good part of that city now is operated by Vietnamese businesses. So it's been many years in the making. But I remember when it was just one intersection, one intersection that had just maybe about 4 or 5 Vietnamese businesses. That was a long time ago.
The transformation of this area from farmland to a vibrant cultural hub didn't happen overnight. It required capital, business acumen, and collaborative effort. One of the most fascinating aspects of Little Saigon's development was the traditional financial system that helped newcomers establish businesses. Joe Dovin describes how this crowdfunding approach, rooted in Vietnamese and Chinese traditions, helped the early evacuees and refugees pool their resources and build momentum.
We had nobody to borrow from except each other. In Vietnamese, there's a term called hui, H-U-I, or chơi hui, is to play the fund or the hedge fund. And hui is actually a Chinese word because the Chinese expatriates and migrants who came to Vietnam taught us how to do that. As Chinese immigrants everywhere, they have to pool their resources together in order to have enough capital to be competitive in any new community that they find themselves in, including Vietnam. So a lot of the ethnic Chinese are very adept at creating these hedge funds, these crowd funds. Long before crowdfunding became a thing, the Chinese ethnic communities have been engaged in this activity for hundreds of years. It's very successful, especially in business, based on trust and an honor system, where you pool your money together, either on a monthly basis. Each family or individual contributes to a general fund. And then the person or persons who created the fund structures the money so that it's loaned out to a certain party to use for certain purposes, which generates a profit. So you're going to get a return on investment and your capital back when it's your turn to collect against that crowd fund. So you can literally capitalize any project overnight. There's no tax implications. There's no bookkeeping needed. It's just a ledger where people contribute and then they know when they get their money back. It's a matter of months or years or however they can afford it.
This system had several advantages beyond just providing access to capital. It reinforced community ties and trust, created mentorship opportunities for new entrepreneurs, and established economic networks independent of mainstream American financial institutions, which were often inaccessible to refugees with limited English and no credit history. Despite the coefficients of social and economic drag in their new homeland, most of the early waves of people coming in from Vietnam felt truly liberated, as Joe Dovin explains.
We're coming from a war-torn country with 20, 30 years of nation building in the south of Vietnam during a full-blown civil, regional, and international war. Well, try doing that. Any government will fail. You can't build democracy, you can't build freedom, you can't build a civil society when you're fighting a civil war and an international and regional war all at the same time with limited resources and with allies who are not dependable, who have a different agenda than you. Now, boil that down to the average everyday man who's just trying to hold down a job, take care of his family in a society that death and destruction is all around you. But you have to fight through it. You have to struggle. You have to do your best. The opportunities are not there. The freedoms are not there. You're not protected by the law. You don't have the resources. You don't have the support network. You don't have any of the levers or powers that will allow you to succeed whatsoever. And anything you build up, you're going to lose it in a matter of days, if not weeks, not even years. But through all that hardship, through all that struggle, the Vietnamese people did manage to build a very good society. They just couldn't keep it because they were under invasion, and the invaders were hell-bent on destroying and taking over their country, which they successfully did after the Americans divest from Vietnam. So fast forward, when the refugees come here, the conditions were much more conducive to their success. They come with a lot of skill set. A lot of them spoke French under the French colonial system. They did go to France, they did get a French education, and they know the Western ways. And then others learned under the American system. Americans gave us a lot of support in terms of education, of training, of trying to westernize at least the southern parts of Vietnam, and to some extent successfully. So the people who were more advanced than the rest of the population in terms of their training and education were also the ones that were evacuated and became the first and second wave of refugees here. So once they were here, their hands were untied. So they were able to release your full potential. And the drive was there. You wanted to learn as much as you can. You want to get a good education. You put your kid through school. You want to hold that third job. You want to be able to save up. You want to be able to crowdfund. You want to be able to use or take advantage of the freedom that you have that you didn't have before.
The story of the Vietnamese nail salon industry deserves a special mention here. From nearly zero presence in 1975, Vietnamese immigrants now dominate this industry in America, accounting for roughly 80% of all nail technicians nationwide. This remarkable achievement began with a small group of refugee women who were trained by an American actress and grew it into a multi-billion-dollar industry that has provided economic opportunity for thousands of Vietnamese families. The transformation of Vietnamese refugees into successful business owners and professionals wasn't simply an economic phenomenon. It reflected deeper cultural values. A strong emphasis on education and hard work became defining characteristics of the Vietnamese American community.
Diplomas and degrees, very driven to earn, because if you want to compete, you better have a higher degree than the next guy over, not just the same, higher. And then you have to be an educated professional. You're going to put yourself through law school, medical school, engineering school, whatever it takes to get a leg up.
For that first generation, this drive often meant working multiple jobs in low-wage positions while studying English and pursuing education. Fa Lei recalls how his parents prioritized education while struggling to make ends meet.
At our lowest point, we were living in a boarded-up garage. Someone put up plywood on the walls, gave us a layer of carpet, hung up some halogen lamps, and called that a living apartment. So we rented that from them for $250 a month. To cook, we cooked under a tree right outside of that garage. We weren't allowed to use the main house to cook. But that was still fine because that's what we did in the refugee camp just a couple of years before. We cooked outdoors. So we just bought some burners and we cooked outside and we were fine for about 2.5 years. But it bought us enough time for my dad to get a associate's degree and my mom to go to trade school. And after they both got their degrees, they started making money and then they pinched and saved and got us a condo in San Gabriel. And that's where I earned my place to go to UCLA.
While economic achievement was crucial, preserving cultural identity proved equally vital to the Vietnamese American community. In the early days, this meant creating institutions that could maintain language, traditions, and a shared sense of history. Dinh Le explains the significance of traditional practices and symbols in maintaining this connection to his heritage.
So I'm wearing what's called an áo dài, which is the traditional Vietnamese long dress. So it's both men and women wear it. And, nowadays we wear it typically on like occasions only. We don't wear it every day, obviously. And so for them to have the opportunity to wear the dress, like really makes you stand out as a Vietnamese. It identifies you as a Vietnamese person. So that's why we wear it on a day like today.
Media played a crucial role in preserving language and culture. Do Jung's newspaper Nuoi Viet was founded in 1978, just 3 years after the fall of Saigon. He describes how these media outlets served as cultural bridges and how they had to carefully navigate the sensitivities of their traumatized readership.
Yes, we play a very important role in Saigon. Before, about 10 years ago, most people here, if they can read English, they can understand well. We are the one who translate it, okay? Not the way that people normal understand. You have to know the thinking of people. You have to know how to use the word. Because we know how they read it.
Can you give me an example?
For example, there's some word that's taboo. Yeah. For example, the word register. After 1975, when the war was ended, a lot of high-ranking officers from South Vietnam have to register to go to the re-education camp. At first, they heard only 10 days. They was announced, okay, you can bring the food enough for 10 days. And they thought it was only 10 days, but never 10 days. It's 10 years or 3 years or even 20 years. And when they heard it, when they hear the word register, they hate that. It brings back bad memory. So when you see that word, unless you have to use it, but normally if you can avoid it, you use different word.
So sign up to vote instead of register to
Exactly.
vote. And you have to have that kind of understanding of the nuances of language in order to serve your community.
Yep.
It's amazing.
Yep.
Religious institutions, Buddhist temples, Catholic churches, and Protestant congregations also played vital roles in preserving cultural heritage while helping refugees adapt to American life. These spaces provided both spiritual comfort and practical assistance, offering language classes, cultural celebrations, and social services to newly arrived families. All of these things helped early refugees adapt to life in America, which raised questions for them about how to handle their children who were growing up American. Navigating between Vietnamese culture at home and American culture at school created complex notions of identity. Dr. Julie Pham describes her experience. When you were growing up here in Seattle, were you and your family sort of integrated into this Vietnamese community?
Yes, actually, I'd say that my parents were real leaders in it because my parents founded the first privately owned Vietnamese newspaper in the Pacific Northwest. And that was in 1986. So growing up, I had a very strong sense of my Vietnamese identity. And it's interesting to compare that to other people, other Vietnamese Americans' experience, especially of my generation, where there was perhaps more shame or just, oh, let's not talk about it. And for me, growing up, my parents were always telling us to be a refugee is something to be proud of.
So you're the child
And
of journalists
yeah.
or publishers in any case. Yeah.
Yes. And so, I remember if I wore a t-shirt with our newspaper's logo to school, someone would say, oh, my parents read the newspaper. People seem to know who I was because of my parents. And so that just instilled a lot of pride in me growing up.
And how did that pride manifest itself? Were you involved in I don't know, community events or community issues? I mean, how did your connection to that community develop?
I grew up in the generation of assimilation. And so actually until age 5, I spoke Vietnamese at home. But from then on, once I entered the school system, I only spoke English. And growing up, I would help my parents with the newspaper, and I was proud of the heritage, but I didn't do any, say, big Vietnamese activities. It wasn't until I got to college that I started studying the history, and I decided that I was going to be a history major. And I was getting really interested in the way that their Vietnam War was portrayed in American history books. And so that was actually my first, me getting interested in actually me talking to my parents about their experience in the war, because we actually never talked about it growing up. And that's the experience of a lot of people of my generation, children of my generation.
For the second generation, those born in America to refugee parents, understanding their parents' experiences could be difficult. James reflects on how his perspective has evolved over time.
Every now and then they always say, oh, you don't know what happened, what we had to do to survive. And as a child growing up here, you always feel like, oh, your parents are always telling those stories about, walking to school in the snow, or you always feel like there's some exaggeration in what they suffer. But I think a lot of it, what my parents told me is true, knowing the history of how the escape happened, But I think growing up, I kind of just swept it under the rug. I was thinking, oh, whatever it is, I don't think I realized the significance of it when I was younger.
Yeah, it sounds like they downplayed it a bit.
Right. And I think it's just for us to try to have a normal life to the degree possible,
Political divisions also emerged within the Vietnamese American community, particularly between generations and between different waves of immigrants. But the tensions are so subtle, they're nearly invisible to most of us and difficult to understand. Here's Do Jung of the Nui Viet Daily News.
Vietnamese community is a very conservative community. Okay? And later on, until the 2000s, it's kind of more liberal, a little bit, because the young generation grew up. Okay? Before we have only our own generation, most of people come from Vietnam, and they are more Catholic. Buddhism is kind of more conservative, right? Secondly, they associate with the word republic, because the name of the South Vietnam is Republic of Vietnam. Mm-hmm. And then people will say, oh, we have to follow Republican Party. Mm. So many of them, I think about 70 or 80%, or even nearly 100% when I came here in 1993, are all Republican, are very conservative. They vote for Republican.
Always looking toward Little Saigon's future, Joe Dovin has a vision for the Vietnamese American community that extends beyond its current boundaries.
There has been a lot of integration between all of the groups over time, and that makes for a strong community. I would like an integrated society, not an isolated one. So as a community leader and elected here, I resist the isolationist tendency, the tribalist tendency to lock yourself up in Little Saigon. That's not going to help us grow. So there have been movements to build gates and bridges and kind of close ourselves off to the mainstream community and events that are particular to ethnic Vietnamese, and I reject that. I always say whatever event, whether it's Tet Festival or any other celebration that we hold year-long, even religious events. We invite mainstream. We have an open door policy.
Today, Little Saigon stands as a testament to the resilience and determination of Vietnamese refugees who simply refused to let tragedy define their future. What began in the chaos of evacuation and the uncertainty of refugee camps has evolved into a vibrant community that contributes to the American cultural landscape while preserving its own unique heritage. For those who made this journey, from refugees to residents, the commemoration of the 50th anniversary of the fall of Saigon brings complex emotions. Din Lê reflects on what this milestone means to him and his family.
So the 50 years is not meant to be a celebration. It's a remembrance of the day that South Vietnam, fell to the communists, right? So for us, it created this exodus of Vietnamese people, especially to America, and how over the last 50 years, the Vietnamese people have made America home, and the United States of America has given our community so much more, right? And so while a day like April 30th is not a pleasant memory, the outcome of that is that we're able to persevere and come to a country as great as the United States of America and, make a living for ourselves and raise our families and contribute to this society. So that's the result of the last 50 years of us having been here.
In the third and final episode of this series, we'll explore how the Vietnamese American community has evolved over the past 5 decades. We'll examine their cultural and economic contributions, their political engagement, and how their success stands as a living testimony to the enduring value of America's involvement and sacrifice in Southeast Asia. That's 2 weeks from now. We'll see you then.